Imagine a weapon so deadly, it was banned by neighboring kingdoms, not because it was too brutal, but because no army could defend against it. A blade that could sever a man's arm through chainmail with a single strike, forged using techniques modern metallurgists still can't fully replicate. But the world of ancient African warfare holds far more than the spears and shields you see in museums. Buried deep in the sands of the Sahara and hidden in the oral histories of warrior tribes are weapons that rewrote the rules of combat. Blades sharper than surgical scalpels, forged in fires hotter than medieval European furnaces. Throwing weapons so perfectly balanced, they could decapitate a charging warrior from 50 paces. Designed so lethal, neighboring empires developed entirely new fighting styles just to survive against them. Today, we'll uncover 5 of the most devastating ancient African weapons, each one more ingenious and deadly than the last. And the first one? It's a blade so feared, enemy soldiers would rather flee than face a warrior who carried it. Weapon 1. The shotel. Picture this, Ethiopia, 4th century AD. The Aksumite Empire is at its peak, controlling trade routes from the Red Sea to the heart of Africa. Their armies are legendary, but it's not their numbers that terrify their enemies. It's a single curved blade that seems to defy the laws of combat itself. The shotel. At first glance, it looks almost impractical. A sickle-shaped sword with a curve so extreme, it forms nearly a semicircle. You'd think it's ceremonial. You'd be wrong. Here's what made it absolutely lethal. While your enemy raised his shield to protect himself, the shotel's curve allowed its wielder to reach asterisk around asterisk that shield. The blade would hook over the top or snake around the side, stabbing or slicing into the neck, face, or shoulder, parts of the body most warriors left exposed. Traditional blocking techniques? Useless. The shotel made every defensive stance obsolete. But there's something even more sinister about its design. The curve wasn't just for reaching around shields. When a skilled warrior pulled the blade back after a strike, the hooked shape would asterisk catch asterisk on flesh and armor, tearing through muscle and sinew with devastating effect. It wasn't just a stab, it was a pull, a rip, a guarantee that even a glancing blow would cause catastrophic damage. Ethiopian warriors trained from childhood to master this weapon. The grip technique alone took years to perfect, because the unusual balance meant every swing had to compensate for the curve. But once mastered, a shotel warrior could dismantle an entire formation. Historical accounts describe Aksumite soldiers wielding shotels in both hands, creating a whirlwind of curved steel that could gut a horse, disarm a swordsman, and hook a spear shaft all in the same flowing motion. Arab traders wrote with terror about facing these blades in battle, calling them the devil's sickle. The metallurgy was centuries ahead of its time. Ethiopian blacksmiths used a specialized smelting technique, heating iron ore with charcoal in clay furnaces that reached temperatures European smiths wouldn't achieve until the Renaissance. The result? Steel that held an edge longer, flexed without breaking, and could be sharpened to a razor's finish. But here's where it gets even more fascinating and darker. The shotel wasn't just a weapon of war. It was an executioner's tool. Its curve made it perfect for beheading, and historical records show that Aksumite rulers used ornate shotels during public executions, the blade's shape ensuring a clean cut through the neck in a single stroke. It was theater. It was terror. It was a message. And yet, for all its lethality, the shotel required something most weapons didn't: absolute fearlessness. To use it effectively, you had to get close. Close enough to smell your enemy's fear, close enough to feel their last breath. Most warriors couldn't handle that psychological pressure. But those who could? They became legends. Now, as devastating as the shotel was in individual combat, the next weapon on our list didn't care about honor or skill. It was designed for one purpose: killing from a distance with such precision that your enemy never saw it coming. Weapon 2. The Hunger Monger. Central Africa, 18th century. The Azande warriors of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo have perfected something that looks like it came from a nightmare. Multiple curved blades jutting out at impossible angles from a central shaft. It looks chaotic, random, like someone welded together 3 different weapons by accident. That chaos is the point. The Hunger Monger, also called the Mambali, is perhaps the most ingenious throwing weapon ever created, and here's why. No matter how it flies through the air, no matter how it tumbles or spins, at least one of its blades will hit the target in a lethal orientation. It's aerodynamically designed for chaos. Let me explain how terrifying this is in practice. A skilled Azande warrior could hurl this weapon from 30 meters away. As it flies, it rotates unpredictably, not like a knife that spins in a controlled arc, but like a helicopter blade mixed with a boomerang. Your enemy sees it coming and tries to dodge. Doesn't matter. The multi-blade design means that whether it hits you edge-on, flat, or at any angle in between, something sharp is connecting with your flesh. But here's the truly genius part. The Hungermonger wasn't just thrown overhand like a spear. Warriors would hurl it sidearm, making it spin horizontally like a deadly frisbee. This horizontal rotation meant it could hit multiple enemies in a single throw, the blade slicing through the first warrior and continuing with enough momentum to wound the second or third in formation. Historical accounts from Belgian colonizers in the late 1800s describe facing Azande warriors who could throw 3 Hungermungas in the time it took a soldier to reload a rifle. By the time you took aim, you were already bleeding out from 3 different blade wounds. The psychological warfare element was just as brutal as the physical. Imagine you're in a forest battle, and suddenly these spinning multi-bladed nightmares are coming at you from the trees. You can't predict their trajectory. You can't block them effectively because you don't know which blade will hit first. Shields were nearly useless. The weapon could hook over the top, slip around the side, or simply punch through weaker spots with its sharp protrusions. The forging process was sacred. Azande blacksmiths would spend weeks on a single Hungermonger, heating and folding the iron repeatedly to create a blade that was both flexible and hard. Each warrior's weapon was unique, customized to their throwing style, their arm strength, their preferred combat distance. You couldn't just pick up someone else's Hungermonger and use it effectively. It was as personal as a fingerprint. And here's something most people don't know. The Hungermonger doubled as a brutal close combat weapon. Those curved blades? Perfect for hooking an enemy's weapon and yanking it away. The central shaft could be gripped at different points, turning it into a long-range slashing tool or a short-range stabbing implement. It was 5 weapons in one. The Azande weren't just warriors, they were strategists. They knew that European armies with guns had superior range. So they perfected ambush tactics, using dense jungle cover to get close enough where the Hungermonger's spinning death became more effective than musket fire. Colonial records show entire expeditions being routed by what they dismissed as primitive tribesmen with decorative throwing irons. But before moving on, I would like to ask you for something. If you like these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing. It's free. Those decorative throwing irons killed hundreds of colonial soldiers before European forces finally learned to respect the weapon's range and deadly unpredictability. Yet, for all the Hungermonger's versatility and lethality, it required years of training to master. The next weapon on our list? Any farmer could pick it up and become instantly deadly. Weapon 3, the Makraka. Sudan, 15th century. The Zanda and Mangbitu peoples have created what looks like an oversized sickle. Simple, agricultural, almost boring. European explorers saw it and assumed it was a farming tool. Those explorers were dead before they realized their mistake. The Makraka is a short-handled weapon with a large, curved blade that extends from the shaft at a sharp angle. Think of a question mark made of steel. And that curve? It's perfect for one of the most brutal killing techniques in ancient warfare, hooking and ripping. Here's what made the Makraka absolutely devastating in close combat. While swords rely on the edge and spears rely on the point, the Makraka relied on asterisk leverage star. A warrior would hook the inner curve of the blade behind an enemy's neck, knee, or elbow, then asterisk pull star. The biomechanics are horrifying. Human joints aren't designed to resist that kind of perpendicular force. Knees would snap, necks would break, arms would dislocate. But there's more. The Makraka's design meant that every attack had 2 phases. The initial hook, which was fast and difficult to block, and the pull, which was where the real damage happened. Even if the first part of the strike didn't land perfectly, the pulling motion would drag the blade across flesh, creating massive lacerations that bled profusely. Sudanese warriors developed fighting styles specifically for this weapon. They'd feint high, then hook low, targeting the legs. Once an enemy was on the ground, the Makraka became an execution tool, the curved blade perfect for striking downward into the neck or chest cavity. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites shows skeletal remains with distinctive curved cuts in the vertebrae, signature marks of Makraka kills. The psychological impact was immense. Unlike a sword wound, which might be quick, a Makraka wound was asterisk personal star. The hooking and pulling motion meant the warrior was close enough to make eye contact, close enough to hear bones crack. It turned combat into something visceral and terrifying. And here's something that gives you a sense of how practical this weapon was. The Makraka could be forged by village blacksmiths using basic materials. No complex metallurgy, no rare ores. Just iron, fire, and skill. This meant that entire communities could be armed with deadly weapons quickly and cheaply. When colonial forces tried to pacify regions that used the makraka, they found that every adult male was effectively a trained killer. The short handle, usually only about 18 inches, made it perfect for dense jungle combat where longer weapons like spears or swords would get tangled in vegetation. Makraka warriors could fight in spaces where European soldiers with bayonets and sabers were at a severe disadvantage. Reports from the 1800s describe ambushes where Sudanese fighters would appear from thick brush, hook colonial soldiers' rifles away, and finish them with the pull-and-rip technique before backup could arrive. But the makraka had another use that most historians overlook. It was a tool of intimidation during raids. Warriors would hook the weapon into door frames and pull, ripping entire doors off their hinges. The same leverage that destroyed human joints could dismantle fortifications. Imagine hearing that distinctive crack of wood splintering, knowing that in seconds, someone with a hooked blade is coming through your only exit. There are even accounts of makraka being used in judicial combat, trial by battle. Two men with grievances would face each other, each with a makraka, and the fight would continue until one was incapacitated. These weren't long, drawn-out duels. The nature of the weapon meant most fights were over in seconds, ending with a brutal hook and pull that left one man maimed or dead. The makraka proves something important. Lethality isn't about complexity. Sometimes the simplest design, perfected over centuries of combat, becomes the most terrifying. But if you think a hooked blade is brutal, wait until you hear about the next weapon. One that could cut through a man's spine with a single downward swing. Weapon 4, the Mambali Execution Sword. Now we move to a weapon that exists at the intersection of utility and pure psychological terror. The Great Mambali Execution Sword of Central Africa, a massive, forward-weighted blade that was designed with one purpose, severing a human spine in a single stroke. Picture this, a blade almost a meter long, with the weight deliberately concentrated at the tip. It looks unbalanced. It looks unwieldy. But when you swing it downward with the proper technique, physics takes over. The weight distribution creates massive momentum that no amount of bone or muscle can resist. This wasn't like the smaller Mambali throwing weapons we discussed earlier. This was the Big Brother, the ceremonial and execution variant that tribal leaders and warriors carried as symbols of ultimate authority. When you saw someone carrying one of these, you knew they had the power of life and death. The blade's design is fascinating from an engineering perspective. The forward weight meant that even a warrior of average strength could generate devastating cutting force. The center of mass was so far forward that the blade almost wanted to swing downward in a chopping arc. It was self-accelerating. Once you started the swing, the weapon's own weight took over, building speed until impact. Execution ceremonies using the Mambali sword were public spectacles designed to reinforce social order. The condemned would be made to kneel, and the executioner, always someone who had trained for years, would measure the distance, position the blade, and then swing. The forward weight meant that if the executioner's technique was correct, the blade would pass through the neck and embed itself inches into the ground below. Clean. Instant. Absolutely final. But here's what made this weapon genuinely terrifying in combat. While it was used for executions, skilled warriors also carried them into battle. The downward chopping motion was devastating against enemies with shields or armor. A Mambali sword strike from above could split a wooden shield, continue through, and cleave into the person holding it. The momentum was unstoppable. Central African warriors developed a fighting style around this weapon that was all about overwhelming force. They'd position themselves on elevated ground, hillsides, rocky outcrops, where they had the height advantage. Then, when enemies approached, they'd deliver downward strikes that could cut through helmets, collarbones, even rib cages in a single blow. Historical accounts from Arab traders describe seeing Mambali warriors in battle, their massive blades rising and falling like the sides of death itself, each swing ending a life. The weapon was so effective at this downward chopping motion that some Central African kingdoms built their entire military doctrine around terrain advantage, finding or creating high ground where their Mambali warriors could rain down unstoppable strikes. The forging of a Mambali execution sword was a sacred process. Blacksmiths would fast for days before beginning work, believing that spiritual purity was necessary to create such a powerful weapon. The iron would be folded dozens of times, creating layers that made the blade both hard enough to hold an edge and flexible enough to absorb the shock of striking bone. And here's something most people never consider. The Mambali's weight made it exhausting to use. A warrior couldn't swing one of these blades repeatedly for long periods. They had to make every strike count. This created a fighting philosophy built around patience, positioning, and perfect timing. A Mambali warrior would watch, wait, and then deliver a single, devastating blow that ended the fight. The psychological impact on enemies was profound. If you saw a warrior carrying a Mambly execution sword, you knew they were confident enough to rely on just a few perfect strikes. It was a statement. I don't need to swing this weapon many times. Once is enough. But as terrifying as the Mambly execution sword was, it required both strength and height advantage to be truly effective. The final weapon on our list needs neither, and in the right hands, it's arguably the most sophisticated killing tool ever created in pre-colonial Africa. Weapon 5. The Kpinga. We've saved the most diabolical for last. The Kpinga, a weapon so complex, so perfectly engineered for one purpose, that modern weapons designers still study its construction. This isn't just a blade. It's a proof of concept that African metallurgy and weapon design were centuries ahead of what most historians give credit for. Look at a Kpinga and your first thought is, what am I even looking at? 3 to 6 curved blades radiating from a central axis, each one sharpened on multiple edges, the whole thing looking like something between a shuriken and a trident designed by someone who understood principles of aerodynamics that wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. This is the ultimate evolution of the multi-blade throwing weapon concept. The Azande warriors of Central Africa perfected the Kpinga over centuries of warfare, and the result is a weapon that has no bad angle of attack. No matter how it hits, no matter what part connects with the target, something is slicing through flesh. Here's where it gets genuinely sophisticated. The Kpinga was designed with rotational stability in mind. When thrown properly, it would spin in a controlled manner, not chaotically like the Hunga Munga, but in a calculated rotation that kept the blades oriented for maximum cutting surface contact. Imagine throwing a blade that naturally wants to position itself for the best possible hit. The physics are remarkable. Each blade on a Kpinga is curved in a specific way that creates air resistance. As the weapon spins through the air, these curves generate a gyroscopic effect that stabilizes the rotation. It's the same principle that makes a thrown frisbee stable, except here, the frisbee has multiple razor-sharp edges spinning at high velocity. But the true genius of the Kpinga reveals itself in how it was used tactically. Azande warriors didn't throw these one at a time like spears. They would carry multiple Kpingas, 3 or 4, strapped to their backs or hips. In the opening moments of combat, they'd launch them in rapid succession, creating a spinning wall of blades that enemy formations couldn't effectively defend against. Think about defending against this. Shields are positioned for blocking straight-line attacks like arrows or spears. But a Kpinga spinning toward you presents edges from multiple angles simultaneously. Block the top blade, and the bottom one hooks your leg. Dodge left, and the side blade catches your arm. The multi-directional threat meant traditional defensive techniques were almost useless. And here's something that makes it even more lethal. The Kpinga was designed to cause maximum bleeding. Each blade had a specific curve that, when it cut, would create wounds that were difficult to close and impossible to stop bleeding from quickly. The edges weren't just sharp. They were serrated in a way that tore tissue rather than making clean cuts. Medieval European battlefield surgeons could sometimes save soldiers with clean sword cuts. A Kpinga wound? Those men died from blood loss even with medical attention. The forging process for a Kpinga was the most complex in African weaponsmithing. Each blade had to be individually shaped, sharpened, and then attached to the central shaft in precise angles. Get the weight distribution wrong by even a few grams, and the weapon would tumble unpredictably. Master smiths who could forge perfect Kpingas were revered in their communities, often living under the direct protection of chieftains who understood the strategic value of having access to these weapons. Historical records from the late 19th century show that European forces tried to confiscate and destroy Kpingas specifically because of how effective they were against rifles. In the time it took a soldier to load and aim a single-shot rifle, an Azande warrior could throw 3 Kpingas and draw a 4th. And unlike bullets, which could be dodged or blocked by thick cloth, these spinning blades would hook onto any part of the body and tear through. There's a documented incident from 1892 where a Belgian colonial force of 40 soldiers encountered a group of 12 Azande warriors armed primarily with Kpingas. The Belgians had rifles, uniform, military training. They should have won easily. But the Azande used the terrain. They attacked from dense brush at close range, where rifles were difficult to aim. They threw their Kpingas in waves, the spinning blades creating chaos and panic. By the time the Belgians could form an effective firing line, 8 of them were down, bleeding from multiple wounds. The colonial force retreated. The Kpinga also served a ceremonial role. Highly decorated versions, with engraved blades and leather-wrapped handles, were given as gifts between allied chieftains. These ceremonial Kpingas were functional weapons. They could absolutely be used in combat, but they also symbolized the bond between leaders. To gift someone a kpinga was to say, "I trust you with a weapon that could kill me." And perhaps most fascinating, the kpinga influenced weapon design across Central Africa. After neighboring tribes saw how effective they were, smiths began experimenting with multi-blade designs for other weapons. You start seeing axes with multiple heads, spears with side blades, even shields with cutting edges. The kpinga proved that sometimes, more edges really does mean more effective. The weapon fell out of common use not because it was obsolete, but because colonial powers specifically banned its manufacture. Treaties between European colonial governments and African tribes in the late 1800s often included clauses forbidding the forging of multi-blade throwing weapons. The colonizers had faced them in combat and knew how deadly they were. Banning them was a form of cultural and military suppression. Today, authentic kpingas are prized by collectors and museums. But what most people don't realize is that these aren't just historical artifacts. They're evidence that African societies were developing weapons technology that was, in many ways, more innovative than what was being produced in Europe during the same period. While European smiths were perfecting the sword, a design that hadn't fundamentally changed in 1,000 years, African smiths were inventing entirely new categories of weapons based on principles of aerodynamics and biomechanics. The kpinga represents the pinnacle of what ancient African weaponry could achieve. A tool that was art, engineering, and death all forged into one spinning, slicing instrument of war. 5 weapons. 5 completely different approaches to the same problem. How to end a life efficiently in combat. From the curved shotel that made shields obsolete, to the chaotic spinning death of the hunga-munga, to the brutal simplicity of the makraka, to the unstoppable force of the mambali execution sword, and finally to the aerodynamic perfection of the kpinga. These weren't primitive tools. They were sophisticated instruments of war, forged by societies that understood metallurgy, physics, and human anatomy in ways that challenge every stereotype about pre-colonial Africa. If you want to see more documentaries uncovering the hidden history of ancient weapons and forgotten warfare, hit that subscribe button.